The telegram arrived at the small house on the Navajo Nation reservation on a cold February morning in 1945. Mary Thompson's hands trembled as she opened it, already knowing what it would say. Her brother James had been killed in action on Iwo Jima, but what the telegram didn't mention, what few people outside the military knew, was that James had died while transmitting a message in Navajo code, a code that Mary herself had helped develop 2 years earlier when she worked as a civilian translator for the military's code program in California. Mary was one of dozens of Native American women whose contributions to America's wars have remained largely invisible, their stories untold, their sacrifices unrecognized. While the Navajo code talkers eventually received some measure of recognition decades after World War II ended, the women who supported them, who served alongside them in different capacities, who made their own unique contributions to the war effort and to conflicts before and after, have remained in the shadows of history. The story of Native American women in wartime stretches back long before the 20th century. During the Indian Wars of the 1800s, women weren't merely victims or bystanders. They were strategists, warriors, scouts, and leaders. Lozen, the Apache warrior woman who fought alongside Geronimo, was renowned for her ability to sense the location of enemy forces. According to Apache oral tradition, she possessed a supernatural power that allowed her to hold her arms outstretched and turn in a circle, and the direction where her palms tingled would reveal where the enemy was located. She fought in numerous battles, was an expert horse thief who raided Mexican and American settlements, and was considered by many to be as skilled a warrior as any man in Geronimo's band. "Lozen is my right hand," Geronimo himself reportedly said, "strong as a man, braver than most, and cunning in strategy. Lozen is a shield to her people." Yet when the surrender finally came in 1886, when the Apache were forcibly relocated to Florida and then to Oklahoma, Lozen's name was barely mentioned in the official records. The army officers who took the surrender noted Geronimo and the male warriors, but the women who had fought beside them, who had scouted and strategized and risked their lives for their people's freedom, were dismissed as merely part of the band, their individual contributions erased. Buffalo Calf Road Woman, a northern Cheyenne warrior, performed one of the most celebrated acts of battlefield courage in Native American history during the Battle of the Rosebud in 1876, just 8 days before Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn. During intense fighting, her brother Chief Comes in Sight was surrounded by Lakota warriors, and his horse was shot from under him. With bullets flying all around her, Buffalo Calf Road Woman rode directly into the heaviest fighting, pulled her brother onto her horse, and carried him to safety. The Cheyenne named the battle "Where the Girl Saved Her Brother" in her honor. But Buffalo Calf Road Woman's greatest moment came 8 days later at Little Bighorn. According to Cheyenne oral tradition, passed down through generations and only confirmed by tribal historians in recent decades, it was Buffalo Calf Road Woman who struck the blow that knocked George Armstrong Custer from his horse during the battle. As Custer tried to rally his troops, Buffalo Calf Road Woman rode up behind him and hit him with her coup stick, knocking him to the ground where he was killed moments later. This crucial detail that the most famous American military defeat of the Indian Wars may have been precipitated by a woman warrior was left out of white historical accounts entirely, and only survived because the Cheyenne people themselves remembered and told her story. During World War I, when Native American men volunteered for military service in numbers far exceeding their percentage of the population, Native women also found ways to contribute. Josephine Mofsey, an Oklahoma Cherokee woman, joined the U.S. Army Nurse Corps in 1917, serving in military hospitals in France, where she cared for wounded soldiers. In letters home, she described the horrific injuries she witnessed, the young men who called out for their mothers as they died, the overwhelming exhaustion of working 18-hour shifts during the major offensives. "The boys come in torn to pieces," she wrote in September 1918, "and we do what we can with bandages and morphine and prayer. Many of them are Indian boys. I've treated Choctaw, Sioux, Apache, and boys from tribes I'd never heard of. When they're dying, if they speak their native language, I hold their hands and sing to them in Cherokee. I don't think it matters that it's not their language. They hear the sound of home in it. Josephine survived the war and the Spanish flu pandemic that swept through Europe in 1918, but she returned home with lungs damaged by exposure to mustard gas when she had treated patients affected by German chemical weapons. She died in 1923 at age 32, her service to her country having cost her her health and ultimately her life. Her obituary in the local Oklahoma newspaper mentioned that she had been a nurse but said nothing about her wartime service or her sacrifice. World War II brought unprecedented opportunities for women to serve their country, and Native American women seized these opportunities despite facing both racial and gender discrimination. While most Americans know about the Navajo code talkers, the young men who used their native language to create an unbreakable military code, few know about the women who made that program possible. Before the code talkers went to boot camp, before they learned to transmit military terminology in Navajo, linguists and translators had to develop the vocabulary and verify that the code would actually work. Several Navajo women, including Mary Thompson and Ruth Begay, worked as civilian consultants for this project in 1942 and 1943. They helped create Navajo words for military terms that didn't exist in their language. How do you say tank in Navajo? They decided on che da gahi, tortoise. How do you say submarine? Beshlo, ironfish. How do you say bomber? J-show, buzzard. These women worked in secure facilities, sworn to secrecy, receiving modest pay for work that required them to be away from their families and their communities. They tested the code, refined it, taught it to the first groups of Navajo recruits. Their work was classified during the war and remained classified for decades afterward. When the code talkers finally received recognition in the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, the women who had helped create the code were rarely mentioned. Mary Thompson attended a code talkers ceremony in 1989 and sat in the audience as the surviving code talkers were honored. Nobody asked her to stand. Nobody acknowledged her contribution. She went home that night and told her daughter, "It's all right. We did what needed to be done. That's enough." Other Native American women served in more direct military roles. Minnie Spotted Wolf, a Blackfeet woman from Montana, became the first Native American woman to enlist in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve in 1943. She served as a heavy equipment operator, driving trucks at Marine Corps bases. In photographs from that era, she stands proudly in her uniform, her dark hair carefully styled in the victory roll fashion of the time, her expression serious and determined. After the war, she returned to Montana, worked various jobs, raised a family, and rarely spoke about her military service. When she died in 1988, local newspapers ran brief obituaries that mentioned she had been a Marine but provided few details. Ola Mildred Rexroth, a woman of Oglala Lakota heritage, became one of only 2 Native American women to serve as a WASP Women Air Force service pilot during World War II. The WASPs were civilian pilots who flew military aircraft, ferrying planes from factories to air bases, towing targets for anti-aircraft artillery practice, and testing repaired aircraft. It was dangerous work. 38 WASPs died during their service, but these women were not officially recognized as military personnel. They received no military benefits, no veterans recognition, no honors when they died. Ola flew virtually every aircraft the Army used, from small trainers to massive B-17 bombers. She loved flying more than anything, loved the freedom of the sky, the challenge of mastering different aircraft. In a 1944 letter to her sister, she wrote, "When I'm up there, it doesn't matter that I'm Indian or that I'm a woman. I'm just a pilot doing my job. I wish the whole world could be like the sky." After the war, when the WASP program was disbanded, Ola tried to continue flying but found that civilian aviation was even less welcoming to women and particularly to Native women than the military had been. She eventually gave up flying and worked as a clerk for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It wasn't until 1977 that WASPs were finally granted military veteran status, and by then, Many of them, including Ola, had died. Beyond these individual stories, thousands of Native American women contributed to the war effort in ways that have gone largely unrecorded. They worked in munitions, factories, built ships and aircraft, grew victory gardens, collected scrap metal and rubber, bought war bonds, and managed households and communities while the men were overseas. On many reservations, women took on traditionally male roles, working as mechanics, ranchers, loggers, and construction workers to keep their communities functioning during the war years. Ruby Spotted Horse, a Lakota woman living on the Standing Rock Reservation, became the community's unofficial mechanic during World War II when most of the men were away. She taught herself to repair tractors, trucks, and farm equipment by studying manuals and experimenting. People brought her broken machines, and more often than not, she figured out how to fix them. After the war, when the men returned and resumed these roles, Ruby went back to working as a housekeeper and cook. In an interview conducted in 1981, she laughed about those years. For a while there, I was the most important person in the community. Everybody needed me. Then the boys came home, and suddenly I was just Ruby again, making bread and washing clothes. That's how it was. You did what needed doing, and then you went back to your place. The Korean War brought a new generation of Native American women into military service. Susan Deer Cloud, a Mohawk woman from upstate New York, enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps in 1951 and served in a mobile Army surgical hospital, a MASH unit near the front lines in Korea. The conditions were brutal. Bitter cold in winter, stifling heat in summer, constant danger from artillery and air attacks, and an overwhelming flood of casualties during the war's major battles. "We worked until we dropped," Susan remembered in a 1987 oral history interview. "Sometimes we'd have 100 wounded soldiers come in within a few hours, and there were only 3 nurses and 2 doctors. We did surgery in tents, with generators running the lights and the sterilization equipment. We had boys, and they were boys, 18 and 19 years old, die on the operating table, die in the recovery tents, die waiting for surgery. We saved a lot of them, but we lost so many." Susan served for 2 years in Korea and witnessed some of the war's bloodiest fighting. She came home in 1953 with what would later be recognized as PTSD, though at the time there was no diagnosis, no treatment, just an understanding that you needed to push through and get on with your life. She struggled with nightmares and depression for years, but received no psychiatric help from the Veterans Administration. When she finally sought treatment in the 1,970 seconds, she was told that women couldn't have combat-related PTSD because women didn't serve in combat, despite the fact that MASH units were regularly targeted by enemy fire and several nurses had been killed or wounded during Susan's deployment. The Vietnam War era saw Native American women serving in increasing numbers, both in the military and in support roles. Anna Mae Aquash, a Mi'kmaq woman from Nova Scotia who became deeply involved in the American Indian movement, worked tirelessly to support Native American rights and to call attention to the discrimination and violence that Native peoples faced. Though she wasn't a military veteran herself, she advocated for Native veterans who returned from Vietnam to find themselves denied benefits, unable to get jobs, struggling with trauma and addiction. Anna Mae's activism made her a target. In 1976, she was found dead on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, shot execution style. The initial autopsy falsely claimed she died of exposure. It was only after her family demanded a second autopsy that the bullet wound was discovered. Her murder was linked to the violent conflicts on Pine Ridge during the mid-1970 seconds. But the full truth of what happened to her and who was responsible has never been completely resolved. She died fighting for her people, a different kind of warrior than those who wore military uniforms, but a warrior nonetheless. Native American women also served in Vietnam as nurses, administrators, and support personnel. Della Warrior, a Otoe, Missouri woman from Oklahoma, enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps and served at an evacuation hospital in Vietnam, in 1969 and 1970. She worked in the emergency room, the first stop for wounded soldiers coming in from combat. The helicopters would come in, sometimes 3 or 4 at once, full of wounded, Della recalled in a 2003 interview. We'd have to decide who we could save and who was too far gone. That was the worst part, having to choose. Having to tell a 19-year-old kid that we couldn't help him, that he was going to die. I held so many hands, said so many prayers. I'm not sure any of us who worked in those hospitals ever really came home from that war. Della served her full tour and returned to Oklahoma in 1970. She found that people didn't want to hear about her experiences. Vietnam veterans faced hostility and indifference when they came home. And women veterans faced an additional burden. Many people didn't believe they had really been in combat zones, or didn't think their service counted as much as men's service. Della rarely spoke about her time in Vietnam for the next 30 years. It was only in the early 2000s, when she connected with other women veterans through support groups, that she began to process her experiences and share her story. The post-Vietnam era brought new conflicts and new opportunities for Native American women to serve. When the military became all-volunteer in 1973, women's roles expanded significantly. Native American women served in Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, and the peacekeeping missions of the 1,992nd. They worked as pilots, mechanics, intelligence analysts, medics, and military police. They deployed to Bosnia, Kosovo, Somalia, and Haiti. Lori Piestewa, a Hopi woman from Arizona, enlisted in the Army in 2001, shortly before the September 11 attacks. She was a single mother of 2 young children, and she joined the military to provide for them and to serve her country, a tradition of military service that ran deep in her family and in her community. When her unit, the 507th Maintenance Company, was deployed to Iraq in early 2003, she was serving as a Humvee driver. On the 23rd of March 2003, during the opening days of the Iraq War, Lori's convoy took a wrong turn near Nasiriyah and came under heavy enemy fire. Several soldiers were killed immediately. Lori continued driving, trying to get her passengers to safety even as the Humvee took fire. She was seriously wounded but kept driving until the vehicle crashed. She died of her wounds shortly after, becoming the first Native American woman to die in combat while serving in the U.S. military and one of the first female soldiers killed in the Iraq War. Lori's death made national news, but the coverage often focused on the fact that she was traveling with Jessica Lynch, a white soldier who was captured and later rescued in an operation that received enormous media attention. Lori's story, her service, her sacrifice, were often mentioned as a footnote to Jessica's story, despite the fact that Lori had died protecting her fellow soldiers. Her family and her tribe mourned her as a warrior who had died in service to her people and her country. In Hopi tradition, she was honored as someone who had given the ultimate sacrifice. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan saw unprecedented numbers of Native American women serving in combat zones. They worked as medics, treating wounded soldiers under fire, as military police conducting dangerous patrols, as intelligence analysts tracking enemy movements, as convoy drivers navigating roads laced with improvised explosive devices. They served multiple deployments, spent years away from their families and communities, and came home carrying the invisible wounds of war. Micheline Bigman, a Crow and Hidatsa woman from Montana, served 3 deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan as an Army combat medic. She treated wounded soldiers on the battlefield, performed emergency surgery in aid stations, and saved numerous lives. In a 2015 interview, she described the moral injury of war, not just the physical dangers, but the psychological toll of seeing friends die, of making life and death decisions, of carrying the weight of those experiences. People think that if you come home physically intact, you're fine, Micheline said. But some of us came home carrying ghosts. I see the faces of the soldiers I couldn't save. I hear the sounds of battle. I wake up at night thinking I'm back there. and when I try to talk about it, people don't always understand. They thank me for my service, which is nice, but they don't really want to know what service meant, what it cost. Micheline struggled with PTSD, depression, and substance abuse after leaving the military. She attempted suicide twice before finally getting connected with a tribal veterans program that helped her begin healing through traditional crow ceremonies and a combination of Western and traditional medicine. She has become an advocate for Native women veterans, working to ensure they receive the mental health care and support they need. The contributions of Native American women warriors extend beyond those who wore military uniforms. During the American Indian movement's occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973, women played crucial roles in organizing the protest, caring for the occupiers during the 71-day siege, and negotiating with federal authorities. They cooked, provided medical care, cared for children, stood guard duty, and risked their lives when federal agents fired on the occupation. Madonna Thunder Hawk, a Lakota woman who was at Wounded Knee, later reflected on the women's role. The men got most of the attention, but the women kept everything running. We were the backbone of that occupation. We were the ones who made sure people ate, made sure the children were safe, made sure morale stayed strong. We were warriors in our own way, fighting for our people's survival and our rights. These women faced arrest, harassment, and violence. Several were beaten by federal agents. Others were shot at during the frequent exchanges of gunfire. But they stood their ground, understanding that they were part of a long tradition of Native women defending their people, their lands, and their rights. In the 21st century, Native American women continue to serve in the military at rates higher than any other ethnic group of women in America. They deploy to war zones, train for combat, lead units, and earn commendations for valor. They are generals and sergeants, pilots and mechanics, doctors and engineers. They serve in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard. They are veterans of Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the ongoing operations around the world. Yet, despite their service and sacrifice, Native American women veterans remain largely invisible in American culture. When people think of American warriors, they rarely picture Native women. When veterans organizations hold ceremonies and events, Native women veterans are often overlooked. When history books recount American military history, Native women's contributions are rarely mentioned. This invisibility is compounded by the unique challenges that Native women veterans face. They experience higher rates of military sexual trauma than any other group of women in the military. They face discrimination based on both their gender and their ethnicity. When they return to civilian life, they often struggle to access veterans' services, particularly if they live on remote reservations far from VA facilities. They experience PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and other service-connected disabilities at high rates, but may be reluctant to seek treatment due to cultural stigma or lack of culturally appropriate care. Organizations led by and for Native women veterans have emerged in recent years to address these challenges. The Native American Women Warriors, founded in 2010, works to connect Native women veterans with services and support. The organization hosts annual gatherings where Native women veterans can share their stories, participate in traditional healing ceremonies, and build community with others who understand their experiences. Bunny McBride, a non-Native historian who has studied Native women's military service, observed in a 2018 article, "These women are invisible warriors. They've served in every American conflict since the Revolution, often with extraordinary courage and sacrifice, but their stories have been systematically excluded from the national narrative." It's time we recognize that Native American women have always been warriors, whether they were fighting for their tribe's survival in the 1800s or serving in uniform in Iraq and Afghanistan. The legacy of Native American women warriors encompasses thousands of individual stories of courage, sacrifice, and service. From Lozen and Buffalo Calf Road women defending their people in the 1800s, to the Navajo women who helped create the Code Talkers program, to the nurses who served in Korea and Vietnam, To the soldiers who deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, these women have fought for their families, their communities, and their country. Their stories have been forgotten not through accident, but through systematic erasure by a culture that couldn't imagine women, particularly Native women, as warriors, by military institutions that failed to recognize their contributions, by historians who wrote them out of the narrative, by a nation that has never fully acknowledged its debt to Native peoples, including Native women who have served it so faithfully. Mary Thompson, the Navajo woman who helped develop the Code Talkers program and lost her brother at Iwo Jima, lived until 2007. In her final years, she finally began speaking publicly about her wartime service. She visited schools on the Navajo Nation, telling young people about the Code and about her brother's sacrifice. She attended ceremonies honoring the Code Talkers, no longer sitting silently in the audience but standing with the other contributors to that program, finally receiving recognition for her work. At a ceremony in 2005, 2 years before her death, Mary spoke briefly. For a long time, I thought my story didn't matter because I wasn't a soldier, because I was just a woman doing a job that needed doing. But I've learned that all of our stories matter. The Navajo women who helped create the Code, the Native women who served as nurses and pilots and mechanics, the women who kept our community strong while the men were at war, we were all warriors in our own way. We fought for our people and for our country. It's time our stories were told. Those stories are finally beginning to be told, though much work remains to fully document and honor the contributions of Native American women warriors. Each ceremony that includes them, each history book that mentions their service, each museum exhibit that displays their photographs and tells their stories represents a small victory against the erasure they have endured. The young Native women serving in today's military stand on the shoulders of these invisible warriors. They carry forward a tradition of service and sacrifice that stretches back generations. And perhaps, finally, their service is beginning to receive the recognition it has always deserved, not as a footnote to men's stories, not as an afterthought in the narrative of American military history, but as an essential chapter in the long story of Native American courage, resilience, and warrior spirit.